So let's take a closer look at some statistics on crime in the United States. So this table represents some data showing the percentages of prisoners and the prison population in the United States across race, gender, and as education. Right? So take a minute, look over this data. This middle column here shows the percentage of prisoners with a specific characteristic. So in this case, out of all U.S. prisoners in federal prisons, 38.4% are African American. And then the column on the far right shows the percentage of U.S. population with that characteristic. So in the United States, 12.8% of our population is African American. So take a minute, look over this data. If you want to pause the video for a second, you can, just so you can really analyze this and try and formulate some conclusions here. So one conclusion that hopefully you're drawing as you're looking at this data is that we definitely do not have an equitable distribution of people with certain characteristics in comparison to the percentage of that particular characteristic within the US population. So a simpler way to put that would be to say that if we did not have any sources of inequality in our society, if all humans were indeed treated equally, socialized equally, given equal opportunities, we would expect a relatively equal distribution of prisoners with a certain characteristic in comparison to the percentage of people in the US population with that characteristic. And we definitely see there's some big discrepancies here, right? Especially as we're looking at race, we see that people of color, specifically African Americans and Latinos, as the data in this table suggests, are incarcerated at much higher rates in comparison to their actual representation of the United States population as a whole, right? We also see there is a huge discrepancy in terms of prisoner population when it comes to gender. Almost 95% of prisoners in federal prisons in the US are male, even though they only occupy about 50% of our total population. And then we also see a very strong correlation in terms of education, right? Essentially, the lower level of education an individual has, the more likely they are to be incarcerated, right? 40% of prisoners in federal prisons are individuals with less than a high school education, even though they only occupy 13.4% of our total population in terms of educational attainment, right? So we're seeing some big discrepancies here. And the reason that, again, draw the attention to this is that if we lived in a society where everyone was created equal, we would expect and treated equally, we would expect to see people making mistakes and breaking the laws at relatively comparable rates. And we definitely see there's some huge discrepancies here, which lead us to believe that race, gender, and education probably play a pretty meaningful role in whether or not people, first of all, engage in deviant behaviors and crimes, and secondly, and most importantly, whether or not they are found guilty of completing those crimes in the first place, right? So let's start taking a closer look at some more data that's going to help us sociologically understand these discrepancies in terms of demographics and percentages of incarceration. So it's estimated that only 47% of violent crimes and 35% of property crimes are actually reported to the police. So this means that the vast majority of crimes actually go unreported, which means people are getting away with a lot more criminal behavior than maybe what you would have anticipated, which is just kind of an interesting aside. Despite making up 13.3% of the population, African Americans account for 26.6% of arrests. So again, these discrepancies here that we're seeing in terms of the percentage of people that actually occupy a characteristic within the population, comparatively to the percentages of incarceration, of arrests, etc., these discrepancies are strong indicators to us as social scientists that there's some social behaviors or social factors impacting the likelihood that people with certain demographics would be arrested versus others, right? African Americans and people of color in general are overcriminalized, which is to say that they are more easily assumed to be criminal and treated as such by both the police and the public at large. Now, if you remember back to the week when we talked about race and racism in the United States, I provided findings from many different studies that have proven that racial bias is still a problem in our society, and that if you are a person of color, you do experience systemic oppression as a result of living in a society that was established on racism, it was built on slavery, and those socially learned behaviors of devaluing people of color, while that are now illegal, right? It's illegal to discriminate in employment places based off of race. We still see the effects of implicit bias that we have been socially conditioned for centuries in this country. And I think the vast majority of you, when I was reading through your responses to guided questions on that week, the vast majority of you were able to come to terms with that and to recognize that racism still exists, that you can have bias and racial bias, and indeed we all have racial bias without being a racist, right? The two terms are distinct from one another, right? Many people in society today are not racist, but we all have racial bias as a result of living in this society where we've been socially constructed to view people of color as less than as the result of the way our nation was colonized, right? That's the sad truth of where we live. So again, it's really important to recognize that racism is still an issue, that white people still get privilege in our society. And again, it's very hard for us white folks to admit that or to acknowledge that or to say, I've never received a leg up because of my race before, but data consistently show us that we do, right? We do. If you've never had to worry about being pulled over because of the color of your skin, or if you've never been followed around the store out of fear of being a shoplifter, you are experiencing white privilege. And that doesn't mean that you might not experience marginalization or oppression in other factors of your life, right? You could be a poor white person, right? So you could be experiencing oppression because of your socioeconomic status. But what white privilege means is that you will never experience oppression because of the color of your skin. And crime rates and the over-policing and the over-criminalizing of people of color, specifically of African American people, are strong indicators that racism still exists, right? So despite the fact that white and African American people use drugs at approximately the same rate, African American people are 3.7 times more likely than whites to be arrested for drug charges, right? Which is to say, if you were at a party and it got busted and a lot of people in there were smoking pot, if you are white, you are almost 4 times less likely to get arrested for possession of marijuana than if you were an African American. If you're driving your car and you get pulled over and cops find out you got a little weed in your glove box, if you're white, you're almost 4 times less likely to actually get arrested for having that weed in your car, right? Study after study after study after study has proven this to be a reality, which is why we can see that deviance in crime are again socially constructed, and the likelihood of being convicted of a crime is greatly impacted by demographic factors, particularly by race. So let's look at a little more closely at some inequalities in the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system that we have in the United States is currently set up to privilege people with money. And this is why. All right, so if you are arrested in the US and you can't afford bail, you have to remain incarcerated until your court date. So this could be months, right? So if you don't have that few thousand or several $1,000s, whatever your bail is set at, to get out, you are going to be sitting in a prison cell until your court date. And like I said, that could be weeks, could be months, right? It could be a very long time. So imagine missing out on all of that income. Obviously, you'd get fired if you didn't show up to your job for weeks or months. So you're going to be losing that money, in addition to not having the money to get yourself out to take care of your children or to go to work or to do whatever it is that you need to do on a day-to-day basis. So if you can't afford bail, you probably are not going to be able to afford an attorney, right? Attorneys are very expensive. So in that case, you will be appointed what's called a public defender. So public defenders are attorneys that are provided to you by the state. Public defenders are notoriously overworked and they're underpaid, and they can very rarely dedicate their full attention to any of their cases. Public defenders could be serving a few up to a dozen different clients at the same time. So imagine you are being accused of a crime, maybe something that you didn't even commit, but you got arrested and you're being charged for it, but you can't afford an attorney that can actually dedicate their time and their energy to your case to try and prove your innocence, so you get left with a public defender. And I'm not throwing any shade on public defenders. It's a very selfless job to become a public defender because they are very overworked, they're spread exceptionally thin. But as a result of that, they really just can't dedicate all their time and energy to the clients that they're being assigned to. So regardless of your guilt or your innocence, defendants who have been appointed public defenders will typically be encouraged to take what's called a plea bargain, wherein essentially defenders plead guilty to crimes that maybe they didn't even commit just so they can get a lesser prison sentence, right? So we can start to see how our criminal justice system is really built on this kind of capitalist ideology that if people have money, they can almost buy their way out of crimes in some instances, or at the minimum, at least purchase an attorney who can make sure that their sentencing, the punishment that they get for their crimes, are less severe. So the costs of trying to fight crimes and to declare innocence in the United States being attached to a price tag have really resulted in what we refer to as mass incarceration, which is the growth of incarcerated populations over the past several decades and the social, political, and economic conditions that have caused it. Today, there are about 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States. While the US accounts for only 4.5% of the world's population, we account for 25% of the world's incarcerated population. So let that sit in here, all right? The United States accounts for less than 5% of the world's total population, but we are home to a quarter, 25% of the incarcerated people in the world, okay? This should draw a lot of red flags to us as a society, right? Is the United States really the most violent, the most deviant country in the world? You know, the way we're socialized and the way we're taught to view other countries, we definitely wouldn't think so. You know, you would expect countries that are, wrought with civil wars and conflict to have much higher incarceration rates than we do. Yet here we are holding 25% of the world's incarcerated population. So what's going on here? We have the highest incarceration rate in the world by far. No country even comes close to us. Now, and despite the fact that actual crime rates have dropped significantly since the 1990s, the incarceration rate in the US has increased by 500% over the past 40 years. So the data are telling us that crime rates, right, the rates of murders and burglaries and rapes and everything, they've been dropping consistently over the past several decades, but the percentage of people that we have incarcerated continues to skyrocket. So what is going on here? What can explain this really jarring discrepancy? Well, in the late 80s and early 90s, crime rates were at kind of an all-time high in the US. They were peaking very high. So legislature passed what were referred to as tough-on-crime policies. These policies were intended to help mitigate crime rates, and they included things such as 3-strike laws, which require anyone convicted of a third felony to automatically receive a mandatory sentence. So while this may seem like a fair policy, right, you think, well, anyone that commits 3 felonies and gets convicted of them maybe should serve some time. This law does not take into account some minor crimes that are considered felonies, which lead to some unanticipated consequences of these 3-strike laws. So remember, again, crimes are things that are socially constructed. We as a society have at least somewhat collectively agreed upon what behaviors are labeled as criminal and therefore come with hefty punishments, oftentimes large fines or jail time, right? But again, determining what those punishments are, how severe they are, is another socially constructed facet of society and our criminal justice system. And these 3 strikes policies kind of shed light on how ridiculous some of our current laws are, and especially the punishments attached to breaking some of these particular laws. For example, a 27-year-old man who stole a pizza was mandatorily sentenced to 25 years in prison because of the 3 strikes law. Stealing the pizza was his 3rd crime, and where he was living, stealing that pizza was considered a felony. So even though that pizza probably cost somewhere about $10, stealing that $10 pizza cost this individual 25 years in jail. Right? Another instance, a man wrote a bad check for $94 and was sentenced to 25 years to life. So again, he wrote a bad check, you know. I know I have in the past when I just, back in the day when you had to really balance your checkbook before the days of debit cards, you know, it was easy if you miscalculated one check or you forgot to write in one expense in your checkbook. It was really easy to, write a check for funds that you didn't have in your checking account. which is probably what this individual did. He just wrote one check that was $94 over his ledger, and because of that, because it was his third felony charge in that state, that $94 mistake cost him the rest of his life in jail.